Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. So today I thought I'd do a video comparing the BBS02 to the BBSHD. So these are Bafang's mid-drive motors. They're kind of electric bike conversion kits. You take these motors, you take the bottom bracket out of your bike's frame, and then you slide in these motors into the bottom bracket shell of your bike, and you secure it onto your bike with a lock ring. And then you've got a motor, a mid-drive motor that's in your bike's bottom bracket, and it drives the chainring that drives your bike, right? So I see a lot of videos that are kind of comparing the BBS02 to the BBSHD, and a lot of times you'll hear people say, "Oh, well, the BBS02 is like 90% as good as the BBSHD, and the BBSHD is a lot more expensive, so you might as well just buy the BBS02 because it's 80% as good." And so that's kind of true, but I want to get into a little bit more detail, a little bit more nuance, and talk about the BBS02 versus the BBSHD, and hopefully help you decide, make a decision which motor is right for you and which one suits your riding style better. So let's get into it. So I'm going to refer to the O2 and the HD. I'm not going to say BBS every time, right? So from here on out, I'm going to refer to the BBS02 as simply the O2. I'm going to call the BBSHD the HD. All right. So what I would say is the BBS02, this motor is a great motor if you want to ride your bike like a bike. So that means that on the O2, you're going to be pedaling, right? You're going to be shifting the gears on your bike. You're going to be helping your bike out. You're not always going to be giving it full throttle everywhere. That's kind of how this O2 is designed to work, right? It's not really like you can just throttle around on it, but you have to be a little bit more careful that your bike is in the right gear, and you got to be a little bit more careful about, like throttling up hills and putting too much of a load on the motor, because the O2 can overheat more easily than the HD, right? And that's partially just because if you look at the HD, you can see it's got these big cooling fans or cooling fins on the outside of the casing, where on the O2 it's got like these little kind of ridges, but they're not, there's not a whole lot of surface area on those fins on the O2. But you can always get your own cooling fins and then put them onto the motor yourself. So that's an option with both of these. So I would say that's kind of the first main thing about the O2 is most of the time you're going to want to pedal that thing. Like, you're going to be able to tell if you're not pedaling it, you're going to be able to tell, you're going to be able to notice that little loss of power and speed that would have otherwise been gained from your pedaling, right? I would say the BBS02, you can get this thing going 25 miles an hour fairly easily on flat. And it can get going depending on your gearing, and the size of the wheels on your bike and stuff. It can get going a good 30 miles an hour or more. I think I've got a BBS02 going like 35 miles an hour down a bit of a hill. But again, that depends on your gearing. On flat, I would expect probably about 25 miles an hour. And if you have some distance to gain speed, you've got a little bit of room to gain some speed, you can get going 30 on flat with the O2, but it's dependent on your pedaling, right? Whereas with the BBS HD, you can get going 30 miles an hour fairly easily, with or without pedaling. And depending on your bike and the gearing, the BBS HD oftentimes can get going like a good 35 miles an hour, full throttle, giving it everything. So the HD is a little bit more powerful. It's got the 30 amp stock controller instead of the 25 amp controller that's in the O2. So that means when we multiply that current by the voltage, Ohm's law, that means that the BBSHD using the stock controller can do a little bit more, about 300 watts more than the BBS02, right? So the O2, it does 750 nominal, 1470 peak. The BBSHD has got 1000 watts nominal and then 1764 watts peak. Now, something that I will say about this is it doesn't seem like that big of a difference, that 250 watts and maybe 5 miles an hour. But in the United States, in a lot of residential areas, the speed limit is 25 miles an hour, but cars tend to drive slightly faster than the speed limit. So a lot of the times in the U.S., speed limit in residential areas is 25, but cars are going about 30. So that's kind of one thing about the O2 is like you're going to be riding the O2 like a bicycle. You're going to be pedaling. You're going to have to help it out with pedaling. You're going to have to shift the gears on your bike. And even once you've got some distance to get going, it gets going to 25 pretty easily. It can get going faster than that. I've got the BBS02 going a good 30 miles an hour on flat. But I would say, if you're riding on streets and stuff with cars, this might not seem like a big difference in power and speed, but I'm going to say that it's a lot easier to ride the BBS HD on the streets with cars and traffic just because it's slightly faster, right? Like for me, the BBS02, it can get going 25 pretty easily, but cars, when you're going 25 and the cars want to go 30, or maybe even some cars want to go 35, the BBS02 feels a lot more just like a bike. Like you're kind of getting in the way of cars. You can't accelerate off the line quite as fast as an HD. So sometimes when you're riding the O2, you kind of have to ride it like a bicycle. You got to stay to the side of the street. You kind of got to stay out of the way of cars. You're going to be shifting through your gears. It accelerates a little bit slower. You're going to have to... So this is another big thing is on the O2, you're probably going to have to shift through all of your gears on your bike to get it going up to that top speed. And I find that on the O2, it can actually be beneficial to have less gears because then each time you shift, the shift sensor, if you have one, is cutting out power. So if you're trying to accelerate up to 25 miles an hour and you have 8 gears or something, you're going to have to shift a bunch of times. And each time you shift, it's going to cut power. So I'll say that the BBS02, it gets up to its top speed slower, and you're going to have to shift a lot more. And that's part of the reason why it's a little bit slower to accelerate up to that top speed, is because you're shifting more, and the shift sensor is cutting out power during each shift. So what I did on my BBS02 is I put it on a 6-speed bike so that I don't have to shift through so many gears. You can also, if you have a bunch of gears, you can also just do double shifts, where you shift 2 gears at once. But one thing that I've found is that when you're double shifting, the shift sensor is not always accurate. So I wouldn't count on being able to reliably double shift with the shift sensor that these motors use. You can get around that problem if you have a brake cutoff. Sometimes you can just barely tap the brake cutoff and it'll cut the motor power without actually hitting the brakes. So you can kind of use the brake cutoff to cut power instead. Like if you have to shift through a whole bunch of gears. I don't trust the shift sensor, and I'll I'll hit the brake while I'll just gently press the brake to engage that brake cutoff, and then I can shift through a few gears without worrying about that shift sensor working properly. So that's one of the main things about the O2 is like it accelerates a little bit slower. There's going to be more shifting involved because it's less RPMs, right? So you've got like 110 to 130 RPM on the O2, and it's 130 to 150 RPM on the HD, right? So that your cranks are going to be spinning a little bit slower on the O2. You're going to have to shift through more gears to get up to the top speed. And you're going to have to kind of ride it more like a bike. Whereas the BBSHD, this thing is closer to like a motorcycle or a moped. You can get up to that 30 miles an hour very easily. And since the RPM is a little bit higher, 130, 150, you don't have to shift your gears as much because the motor's spinning faster and you can get a little bit more speed out of each gear. So for example, on the O2, so let's say you've got like a 42 tooth chainring in the front, and then you've got like a 32 tooth cog in the back. The BBS02 can probably get going about 12 miles an hour in the first gear, whereas on the HD, you could get going closer to like 16, 17 miles an hour in that first gear. So what that means is basically like it basically lets you get off the line a little bit better when you don't have to shift as much. So when you're on the HD, and let's just say for example you're at a cross light or at like a stop sign or whatever, and you've got cars behind you, the HD is going to be able to take off a little bit better because it's got more torque. But then it's also got more RPM, so in your first gear, you're going to be able to get going faster before you need to shift to keep going faster, if that makes sense, right? So on the O2, if you're at a stoplight, you'll get started going, and then the O2 will get going maybe like 12 miles an hour, and then you got to shift, right? So, and you can get going 12 miles an hour on the O2 fairly quickly. So, I mean, it's like you got to do quite a bit of shifting on the O2. Whereas the BBS HD, depending on the gearing of your bike, you might only have to shift the HD like 2 or 3 times to be able to get the BBS HD up to its top speed, right? So there's a lot less shifting on the HD. And I wanted to put an emphasis on this because it helps you get off the line. The HD, you can ride it in the streets with cars a little bit more easily because it's more torquey. It can take off faster. It can get going 30 miles an hour a lot quicker with less shifting. And in general, it's easier to ride it on the road with cars because it goes just a little bit faster and you get out of the way faster, right? Whereas the O2, just generally speaking, like cars will accelerate faster than the O2, so you'll kind of be slowing cars down, and then the top speed of the O2 is just a little bit slower, and you'll kind of be getting in the way of cars, and you'll have to ride it more like a bike. You'll have to ride it off to the side of the street and be conscious of cars and kind of stay out of everybody's way, right? Whereas the HD, it's more like a moped, or like it's closer to like a moped or a motorcycle. Like it can take off faster. There's less shifting of the bicycle gears involved. There's more torque. There's more power. Yeah, so that's kind of the main thing. Like the O2 rides like a bike. You're going to have to pedal. Whereas the HD is closer to like a moped or a motorcycle. You can just throttle the HD and it's not going to really matter. On the other hand, the O2, it's a little bit less tolerant of abuse. So you're not going to just want to ride the O2 around, giving it full throttle in the wrong gear because you'll easily break something. Whereas on the BBS HD, shifting is not as important it's more tolerant of when you're in the wrong gear. It can handle heat better, right? So on the O2, like, you really got to ride it like a bike. Make sure you're in the right gear. Make sure you're pedaling. The HD, you can just throttle around, and it doesn't. You'll still be able to tell that there's a performance hit if you're not in the right gear, and it's going to be going slower. But the motor probably won't like break or overheat. The HD can handle a little bit more abuse than the O2. So if you're somebody that is kind of very conscious of the abuse that you're putting on your equipment, you could get by with the O2. Just make sure you're shifting your bike, you're not in the wrong gear. Don't put it in the highest gear on your bike and then try and throttle from a stop or throttle it up a hill in the highest gear, because that BBS02 will break down a lot easier than the HD when you abuse it. Right? So let's see. So one thing about the O2 versus the HD is that the O2 is 750 watts nominal. So if you're concerned about the legality of these motors, the BBS02 is 750 watts nominal. The max wattage is higher than that, but that's just how it is for every motor, right? So, I mean, if you're getting technical about things and you're talking to the police or something, the BBS02 is a 750 watt motor. That's the nominal rating of it. So it should be considered legal in the United States, right? Because that 750 watts is the federal limit on e-bike motors. Whereas the HD, this is a 1000 watt nominal motor. Depending on who you ask, this might be illegal, right? Since there's that 750 watt limit. But this 1000 watt number, that's just a number that comes from the manufacturer, right? That's just kind of like the nominal power of the motor. That just means that this motor should be able to do 1000 watts continuously, and it should be able to handle that as a normal load, right? But again, like, if you're concerned about it being legal, the O2 is considered 750 watts nominal, and the HD, while it's not that much more powerful, it is considered 1000 watts nominal, and that would be above your 750 watt legal limit. So, I mean, in practice, is anybody going to bother you? No. Is a police officer driving by going to look down at your bike and see, oh, well, he has the BBSHD and he doesn't have that BBS02, so I am going to pull him over and write him a ticket on his e-bike? No, right? Like, that's never going to happen. You can buy the BBSHD, the 1000 watt nominal motor, and ride it around as much as you want, and chances are nobody is ever going to bother you about it being 1000 watts instead of 750 watts, because both these motors look almost identical, and for the most part these are just e-bike motors. Unless you're doing something outlandish and dangerous and hazardous, then I don't think anybody's going to give you any problems about riding the HD around on the streets, even though it's considered the 1000 watt motor. But some people are very technical and they want to go by the letter of the law and cross their T's and dot their I's exactly. So the O2 is 750 watts nominal. If that's important to you, then you can just get the BBS02, 750 watts. It's considered legal, and you can ride that around and sleep at night, and that'll work great for you because it's legal, right? Where the HD, depending on who you ask, that might not be legal. But it's just like the difference is so minimal that in practice, in reality, nobody's going to know the difference. Nobody's going to give you any trouble. So, like, unless you're really a stickler about keeping things legal, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I've got both these motors. I've rode them around for years. I've never had a problem with either of them, right? So Now, I will say, if you want to ride your bike like a bike, like if you want to pedal, if you want a comfortable pedaling position, if you want a good Q factor on your pedals and cranks and being able to pedal comfortably, the BBS02 is a little bit better for pedaling, I would say, because the RPM is a little bit slower and the power levels are a little bit lower. To me, it always does feel like if I'm actually pedaling a bike like a bike and I'm shifting gears and I'm pedaling, I think that the BBS02 feels really good at that 750 watts level, because your pedaling cadence, if you get the right chain ring and you've got some gearing on your bike, the O2 feels great to pedal. You can have it on the full power and still have a good pedaling cadence. If you want to ride your bike like a bike and pedal and get exercise, the O2 is a really good option, because you can put it on full power and it still feels really good to pedal it. The RPMs are kind of in the neighborhood of, like human pedaling power. Whereas if you go and you look at the HD, the RPMs are a little bit faster, but that also means that your cranks, or that your chainring is going to be spinning faster, and it's going to be harder to help pedal and help the BBSHD out, right? Especially when you're doing more power, 1000 watts. I find when you go over 750 watts, it becomes a little bit harder to help out with pedaling, and that's true on hub motors and mid drives. So if you go with the HD, it's going to be harder to help pedal that thing, right? Just because it spins faster, there's more power, there's more torque. So on the HD, if you want to ride your bike like a bike, that's something to take into consideration. Is like the O2, to me, it just does feel a little bit better pedaling, like if that's how you want to ride. But if you want to ride in the streets with cars, it's nice being able to go just a little bit faster, right? A little bit more acceleration. Not like it's nice to sometimes being able to just hit the throttle and not have to pedal, and you're still kind of going full speeds, right? So, but on the HD, if you want to help pedal the HD, you almost have to turn the power down a little bit, right? Like you might have to lower your pedal assist levels a little bit on the HD if you actually want to be able to pedal and have some resistance in the pedals and be able to help out pedaling. And that's just because more RPM, more power, more torque, right? So the HD, it's not as great for pedaling. Like if you're really into bikes and pedaling and getting exercise and shifting through your gears, and the HD, it's not as good for pedaling. You might have to turn the power down a little bit. It weighs a little bit more. The O2 weighs 13 pounds. The HD weighs 16 pounds. So the HD is like 3 pounds more. So yeah, I mean, that's something to keep in mind. If you're really into bikes and pedaling and you always pedal your bike, and that's just part of how you ride, is like you're really into cycling and pedaling and shifting gears and stuff, the O2 is great. When you get the HD, that increased power, you might have to turn that down a little bit, right? Because the cranks are just going to be spinning so fast that you're not going to be able to help out pedaling as much. So it's something to keep in mind. And the BBS HD, it's a wider motor, so the Q factor is worse, right? Like the pedals on your BBS HD are going to be spread out more than on the O2. That's called the Q factor. So if you're like a big cycling nerd and you know what Q factor means, the O2 has better Q factor and it's a little bit more comfortable to pedal, where the HD, it's a little bit wider. You got to use kind of like some funny crank arms that are offset to clear the motor. And that some people, like cycling enthusiasts, they might not like that wider Q factor on the HD for pedaling. Upgradability, right? So what is the potential of upgrading these motors to a better controller and battery? From my research and what I understand, the HD is going to have more upgrade possibility. It's a little bit more robust, a little bit more rugged, more durable. It's more tolerant of abuse. There's more copper in the HD, right? It's got the cooling fins on the outside of the casing. So if you ever want to put your motor on a better controller and a higher voltage and upgrade your bike, the HD is a lot more upgradable, right? Like there's a lot more possibilities to upgrade your BBSHD. Whereas with the O2, I don't really know that I've ever seen anyone upgrade an O2 to higher voltage and like a better controller. Most of the time when people get the O2, they just kind of ride it and it is what it is. You know, it's an electric bicycle that I pedal and I shift the gears and I help the bike out, right? And that's just kind of how it is. Whereas the HD, you know, there's more potential here for upgrading to high voltage and a better controller, like I have with my 72 volt BBSHD that uses the Phase Runner controller. Now, some people seem to say that there's not a whole lot of difference between the O2 and the HD, other than just like the its ability to mitigate heat and the thermal characteristics. And so I was reading a thread on Endless Sphere where Justin from Grin Tech was he was kind of doing some modeling of the BBS02 and the HD. So you can see here he's got pictures of the BBS02 disassembled, and then there's a picture of the BBSHD disassembled, and he's got a lot of interesting modeling results. But one thing that I thought was interesting is that Justin says that the O2 and the HD are very similar, and apparently if the O2 had a little bit better thermals and it was able to dissipate the heat better, it would almost be just as good as the HD. So it's this thread. I'll put this link if you nerds that want to read all of this stuff and get into the weeds on the BBS02 versus the HD. But I thought that it was very interesting that Justin says that potentially the BBS02, if it had better cooling, it could potentially be better than the HD. So I thought that was really interesting coming from Justin when he was talking about these two motors and comparing them and modeling them in the simulator. I'll leave this link in. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting that potentially the O2, if you could get some cooling fins on the O2, potentially it could be just as good as the HD, according to Justin. So that's something that I might look into. I might upgrade my BBS02 to a different controller and higher voltage in the future and see how much it can handle. I don't have any experience upgrading the O2 to a higher voltage and better controller yet. And I haven't really seen anybody on the internet upgrade it to higher voltage and a better controller either. So in general, I think that it's easier. There's more upgrades available for the HD. There's more accessories, more chain rings, more third-party products are available for the HD. So if you like upgrading things and you like blinging things out and like getting a different motor casing and like with like a grease port where you can inject grease into your motor and like trick it out and all this cool stuff, the HD has a lot more third party like accessories and different chain rings and different things available, whereas the BBS02, there's not as many like spare parts available. There's not as many third party accessories and like cool chain rings and cool like motor, you know, different motor covers that you can put on it and stuff like that. Like the O2, it just kind of is what it is. That's kind of the simple way to put it in terms of like upgradability. The O2, it just kind of is what it is. But the HD, you can upgrade this thing and really turn it into something else on a different controller with high voltage. And so I would say that the HD, there's just more upgradability, more possibilities for upgrades. And the O2, it's probably going to work best if you just kind of leave it how it is, right? Just ride it as it was designed to be ridden. It doesn't seem like a whole lot of people upgrade the BBS02 to like higher voltage and different controllers and stuff, right? Because there's a motor, the HD, that's can handle the heat a little bit better. It's a little bit more robust. So I think it makes sense if you're going to upgrade, go with the HD. But apparently, right, like according to Justin and this thread, you know, if your BBS02 could dissipate heat a little bit better, there's potentially it's a lighter motor, right? And I think that I might experiment with upgrading an O2 to higher voltage and stuff in the future, just to see how it compares with the HD. But yeah, I'd say if you want to ride your bike like a bike and pedal and shift the gears, go with the O2. If you want to ride your bike, you know, if you want to have the possibility of riding your bike more kind of like a moped and riding in the street with cars without getting in the way and maybe upgrading to like higher voltage and a better controller in the future, then I would consider going with the HD. But in general, they're both great motors. There's a lot of spare parts available, extremely cheap on AliExpress. You do kind of have to dig into the Chinese markets a little bit to find these spare parts, but they're very easy to find on AliExpress, and they're very affordable. So even if something does break inside of these motors, it's usually fairly repairable and inexpensive to fix. But yeah, so I wanted to do a little comparison of the O2 versus the HD. Go into a little bit more detail than a lot of other YouTubers go into, and maybe help you out if you're on the fence and you're not sure. I do have a little like outline mind map type thing here if you want the whole presentation just outlined right here. Here it is. The O2 versus the HD. But yeah, that's basically it, guys. You can't really go wrong. They're both great motors. I would say the main thing is like, do you want something that's closer to a bike where you have to pedal and shift gears and help it out? Or do you want something that has the possibility of just kind of throttling around without pedaling and without needing to shift gears as much, right? So that would be the HD. O2 is more like a bike, right? You're going to have to pedal with it. So let me know, what do you think? Do you have the O2? Do you have the HD? Do you have both of them? Let me know what you think about the BBS02 and the BBS HD. Which one do you use? Which one are you thinking about buying? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Hopefully this video helps you out, helps you decide which one to get. And make sure you like and subscribe and all that jazz, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching.